All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Murray, and I am the president of the National Museum of Language. And I'm delighted to be here today and have all of you join us. And I want to mention Dr. Jill Robbins, who's just been on the screen speaking, is our vice president and chief technology officer. She helps keep us running in our virtual environment. And Greg Nedved is our most recent past president, and he's also a member of the board of trustees, and he is managing all of our speaker programs now and doing a really bang up job of it. We've really had a great lineup of speakers, and we're very excited today to have um, Jill to have our group from Languaging HR from Hampton Roads, and who'll be speaking to us about Languaging HR. I'm just going to take a few minutes to give an introduction to the National Museum of Language. I think some of the people online, I think, are familiar with us, but others may not be. So we are a unique, fully virtual museum. We don't have a building. Yeah, we operate as a nonprofit 501c3. We are dedicated to examining the history, impact, and art of language. And as a nonprofit, the museum is guided by its mission and is supported by members, donors, and volunteers. So we don't have an institutional affiliation. We are completely independent. Our mission, if you've seen our website, is that the National Museum of Language honors and supports language acquisition, utilization, and preservation, along with linguistic and cultural diversity. Through our outreach activities and online resources, we celebrate the magic and beauty of human communication. So you see, it's a very broad mission. The museum itself we're a small museum. We explore the transformative powers of language. And the museum opened to the public on May 3rd, 2008, after more than 10 years in the making. We're a trailblazer in the field. At the time we opened, there were no more than 3 museums in the world with a language focus. And our museum examines the history, impact, and art of language. Again, it's very broad. We offer a wide range of exhibits and resources for language experts, students, and the general public. Most of our exhibits are multilingual, featuring content in the original language as well as in English translation. Examples of our content include children's stories, poetry, and international humor. We have a robust speaker program on a variety of topics, from vampires to endangered languages. And our past speaker programs are available on our website, and you can watch or listen to the recordings of these events. We don't operate in isolation, even though we are independent. We're a member of the American Alliance of Museums and the International Network of Language Museums, and we collaborate with experts from numerous educational institutions and research organizations. They greatly help us with our programs and exhibits. So that's a brief introduction to the National Museum of Language. And if there are no questions, or if you have a question, please put it into the chat and we'll try to answer. And otherwise, we're going to turn it over to our speakers who will introduce Languaging HR.
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't want to cut into their time. So I'll keep it as brief as possible. We've got Jill Winkowski and Prudence Salasky, and as you know, they're going to be talking about Languaging HR. Just a little bit about them, and I know you have their bios. When I looked at the bios, I looked at things that they had in common, like, for example, where did they first meet each other, things like this. And both of them have backgrounds as English as a second language instructors. I think Jill did her ESL work overseas, while Prudence, who's British, I think did hers in the United States. And you can tell me if I'm wrong on that. And they also were together at as journalists. They work for a newspaper in Newport News. And I guess you can tell us how you as part of your presentation, you'll tell us how you met. So I always found that interesting, looked at your similar paths.
Right.
I don't really want to say anything else about that, except just to let you go ahead and start on your presentation.
Okay, thank
So
you.
enough on that. Let's move on to the presentation itself. Thank you.
And Prue, you want to get started or?
Oh, are you going to play the music or not? No?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. By the way, the musician who created this music is in our video.
Yes, she's here, Sky Zentz, who is a well-known local musician and also comes from a family of well-known local musicians. Sky was wonderful in doing the original theme music for us. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for giving us this opportunity to spread the word about our podcast and to allow us to get some in-person feedback, which I think we're really looking forward to. And now I'm just going to give you a little personal information about Jill and I, because as Greg pointed out, we have very similar backgrounds in education, linguistics, and in journalism. But we have very different styles. So Jill is very organized. She's very detail and process driven, which is amazing. And I'm more into making connections, following sort of often random leads and wanting concrete results. But together, that really seems to work for us. And what we've discovered is that doing a podcast is really a team venture. We are very, very codependent, and we have a million decisions that we have to agree on for every episode. And Greg said, well, how did you meet? And even though we had such similar backgrounds, we actually didn't meet until we were in syntax class as mature part-time students in the Applied Linguistics graduate program at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. Jill discovered linguistics as a young person, and I discovered it as an old person. And I was really in awe of her love of syntax, because it's still not something that I really love. When I finished I was in the TESOL track, the Teaching English as a Second Language track in this ODU program, and I finished in December 2016. And as Greg mentioned, I went on to teach ESL, but not just in the US. I taught at ODU, but then I also went to Bulgaria for an academic year, 2019, 2020, that was cut short, sadly, by COVID. So I also did an overseas stint. And Jill did her ESL teaching early in her career. And then at ODU, she completed the sociolinguistics track in December 2022. And that's when we talked, and neither of us wanted to drop, so to speak, drop linguistics, because we'd put in all this effort and we loved it. And so we met up in 2023 and we brainstormed and we came up with an idea for a podcast. And at the time, sort of ignorance is bliss, we didn't know, among many, many other things that we didn't know, that more than 95% of podcasters, and some put it as high as 99%, don't make it past episode 3. So we're really pleased with ourselves for making it through episode 12.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we didn't really realize all the production elements coming from print, more print-oriented things like journalism. And so those were all part of the learning curve for us. We didn't actually get started with the producing and publishing the podcast until about 6 months in, after we had done things like set up an online workspace, because we're in 2 different cities and for other reasons, and also coming up with a name. We went through a couple of evolutions. Finding Sky was fantastic. She helped with the music. She's created our music for us. We also needed a logo, because for all the podcasts, we saw the little square and we knew we needed a little square. So, we engaged Patty McDonald to do that. We had to find a recording studio. And we wanted one as opposed to just doing it by Zoom, because we wanted to, come up with some quality sound. And we were so lucky. We have great gratitude for the public libraries in our area, which now have these gigantic maker studios, and within that they have recording studios and people to help you. So we have been using the public libraries for our recording. We had to learn the format of a podcast, and so Prue did a lot of that groundwork, studying other podcasts, how they're set up. And then we also, and the biggest learning curve of all, is learning how to edit audio. So
that is a topic, right?
yes. And through all that, it's been a labor of love. It's been 1 year. We've got 12 episodes in, and I would say the most important ingredient has been perseverance.
Yeah. There was just a lot to learn about the mechanics and the logistics, but at the heart, we really agreed about the purpose, and it only took us a nanosecond to come up with a mission statement, even though it was fairly recently, and that was that it is to create awareness of language and its impact and to connect with the local community. We understand there are lots of podcasts out there about language and linguistics by people who are much more qualified than we are. But by taking a local focus and using a journalistic format, that is, we're the facilitators rather than the experts, that's what we feel distinguishes us and makes it really a special product for our area. And what we've learned is that by taking a linguistics approach, we are opening new pathways to understanding our region. It's just a very different approach, and it's yielding very interesting results, we think.
Yes. And so today in our talk, we decided to have a slide for 11 of our 12 episodes. So we'll be going through each of those, and each of them have a clip, or most of them have a clip from the podcast, and we'll talk sort of formulaically about the language element that we integrated in it, the development of the story, and then some of what we learned about linguistics and the history and culture of our region. And so that on this first slide, you see the map of Virginia, and the red area is our area that we call Hampton Roads. So it's definitely southeastern corner of Virginia.
All right, and parts of northern North Carolina, we should add. But that's
right, that's true. So, and then I'm going to say before I play this clip, it is a little bit, the volume is a little low, so it may take your ear to attune to the clip, and it's from an archive of oral histories that we're going to talk about.
And then my mother went to work up there at the restaurant in Elephant Fall. I stayed home and took care of all 9 of my sisters and brothers and my grandmama and granddaddy, and send my sister and brother to school. Then we were living in a house that you had to farm. And after my daddy died, we didn't have nobody to farm. So
was it your house, or were you?
No, the man that we living on the farm for. See, daddy was farming, and he got the house free of charge for farming. And the light bill and everything, the white man paid for it because we living in here and daddy was farm. But after daddy died, won't nobody there to farm, so he put us out. And that's how we end down here in Carrollton. We came to Carrollton.
Do you remember what year, about decade was it?
So that was Mary Chapman, who grew up in the Jim Crow era of segregation in Virginia. And her granddaughter interviewed her for Tidewater Voices Oral History Project. So Tidewater Voices is a long-running oral history project administered by Dr. Bridget Anderson at Old Dominion University. And since 2005, her linguistics students have been conducting field interviews. So it's kind of a two bonus thing for Dr. Anderson. She could teach field techniques and then also build a database of oral histories for the university. And this collection was uploaded as a digital archive in 2023. It was actually part of my internship at ODU that we got it up worked with the libraries. So it's called Tidewater Voices. It's available online. You can go and visit, and there's over 300 oral histories on there.
I just want to chip in there that it would not be there but for Jill's efforts. She's very modest in that regard, but she's really the driving force behind getting it online and available to the public. It's very exciting.
Yes. And that's our logo for Tidewater Voices in the center of this slide. And for this podcast, we highlighted 2 of the oral histories by interviewing the interviewers, so the students, and using clips from the oral histories to provide examples of salient features of the Tidewater dialect, such as, for example, post-vocalic non-rhoticity, which is the dropping of the R after a vowel. And so we just, we kind of pick features and highlight them in our podcasts. So to talk about the 2 people who were interviewed, and that Mary Chapman was, as I said, born to an African-American sharecropping family in Suffolk, Virginia in the 1940s. And she was the oldest of 10 children. Her public education got cut short in the 8th grade because her father died and he was a sharecropper, so they had to move. And her mother actually became the breadwinner. She began work at a restaurant in Elephant Fork in Suffolk. And so Mary Chapman became the caregiver for entire family. So 9 siblings, she got, took care of them, and then 2 ailing grandparents. So that's her story. And there's just an amazing oral history recorded of her. And then, so the really interesting thing about her oral history, she talks in great detail about living in Suffolk during the time of the Jim Crow laws, and gives accounts of separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, not being allowed to enter a restaurant. So really a local focus and view of that in our area.
And it really contrasted with, she married at the age of 18, right? She married someone in the military, and they were deployed to Germany. And so she went from segregated Virginia to being a military wife in Germany, where she enjoyed like full privileges of access to everything. So it was a real contrast to hear that.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I mean, I think she was like 18, I need to get out of here. But then they came back. So, and the picture on there of, on the right, you see a factory, and Mary Chapman did work in the Smithfield packing company for a while. And then also on the left, you see Petty Perkins is the other person that we interviewed. Petty was also a student at ODU and conducted an oral history of her 3 children. And so we interviewed her, and when you listen to the oral history that she collected, there's such an interesting, there are 3 children talking about, school and different hobbies they had, and just some of the features that came up in there. One is uptalk, which is a very well talked about feature that you hear in younger people. And there were some clear examples of that in that interview. So, but I have to say the biggest surprise, and this was a surprise that kind of developed over the 12 episodes, but it started here. And that was in that we weren't looking for it, but in every story about language, even stories about plant names, we uncovered the effects of institutionalized discrimination. And it was a kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, it really is. And it's consistent.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to play the clip. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
A lot in the deaf community feel like the hearing world wants to fix them, and so it's like, well, let's give them a cochlear implant, and then they're going to learn to speak, and they're going to hear like hearing people do. We'll teach them how to talk because they exist in a hearing world, but yet the deaf culture is amazing because they have a culture and they have their language, and it's sign language, and so there's a lot of resistance to taking that aspect, that culture away from them.
Yeah, that was Jubal Metzger-Smith, and we had actually interviewed him as part of the first episode, but the other two women created such a perfect story arc with the looking backwards and the looking forwards. And the other thing was that he is a nationally certified interpreter for the deaf and a teacher, and he had interviewed a woman in Virginia Beach, a deaf woman, but a speaking African-American woman, for Tidewater Voices. And I just was so amazed to learn about the whole field of sign language, about the deaf community, its variations and dialects. So I wanted to explore it more, and I thought it just deserved a full episode of its own. Because a lot of our episodes come down to the fact of like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And then we learn more about it and we contact experts. And so it's sort of self-learning, self-education for us in the hopes that others will be just as interested. And it also served to acknowledge the idea or the fact that most of our communication, whether we're hearing or non-hearing, speaking or non-speaking, most of our communication is in fact non-verbal. So this was a perfect example of that. So for the language basis, it was to look at language variations that apply to sign language just as to spoken language, including code switching. So they talked about how people would change the way they signed depending who they were talking to. So really it paralleled spoken language in every regard. And between them, Metzger-Smith and his Virginia Beach interviewee, they covered a lot of ground because he had originally learned English Sign Language, which is sort of word for word translation, a direct translation method, as a child, a young person, a teen. And it was only later that he studied American Sign Language and took the requisite classes and tests to get certified. And I think I mentioned he's a nationally certified interpreter. So here in Hampton Roads, there's a picture on the screen. Tidewater Community College is the only college in the area that offers an associate's degree in ASL, but it has a robust program there, 2-year degree, ASL being American Sign Language. And another thing about Metzger-Smith, he said he has, quote, a hearing accent, which means that when he signs, even though he's fluent, people whose first language is sign language recognize that he is not deaf, that he's not hard of hearing. They recognize that he is a speaking, hearing person. So I thought that was super interesting too. And he said it happens within, seconds. And that's, again, the same for us, right, with spoken language, when somebody is not speaking their first language, typically. His interviewee had attended both regular and specialty schools for the deaf, and she'd been bullied at the latter for speaking, even though her peers relied on her skills. So we learned a lot too about the divisions and the tensions within the deaf and hard of hearing community. And we also learned about the history and the development of Black American Sign Language versus American Sign Language, and the segregated schools, again, coming back to the racial component in Hampton Roads and throughout the South. In Virginia, there were 2 schools, one for whites in Staunton in the mountains and one for Blacks in Hampton. And then we also learned how desegregation and then school mainstreaming after the passage of the Disabilities Act led to the latter's closing. So there's no longer a specialized school in our Hampton Roads region, even though that one, I think it operated for about 100 years. For the expert, we spoke to Professor Walt Wolfram of North Carolina State. He is a nationally recognized expert on language variation and on African-American speech. And he had students who had specialized in Black American Sign Language. And he spoke about the effects of segregation, again, on the languages. But interestingly, he described Black American Sign Language as the more conservative and actually the standard version of the language, so that it was the ASL that had diverged from the standard, which is BASL, which he again credited to segregation. So the takeaways for me from this episode was that isolation affects language, whether spoken or signed. There are regional variations in lexicon and vocabulary in Hampton Roads. He said there are particular signs particularly for food items and for the word rooster, I think. And that there are complex issues within the community about speaking and non-speaking, and cochlear implants or no cochlear implants. But the biggest surprise was to me was that most parents of deaf children never learn to sign, which I still can't wrap my head around, really. I find that just extraordinary. And I think it goes back apparently to the idea that learning to sign would prevent people from learning to speak. So that's the underlying rationale for it, but that has been thoroughly debunked. Sort of, there's no connection between learning to sign and failing to learn to speak. And on the fun side, we learned about the technological advances for the hard of hearing community. And those are just incredible now, some of the things that are going on, including that one of the latest developments, which was a special football helmet for the quarterback at Gallaudet, which is, we discovered, the only university in the world that is geared to the liberal arts for deaf and hard of hearing people. And that incidentally also started as a segregated school, but is obviously no longer. And the local aspect of all of that was that our sound studio helper revealed to us that his brother was in fact deaf, and that his mother had never learned to sign, and that his brother attended Gallaudet University. So it's a small world, and we had immediate connection locally. And with that, over to Jill.
Sorry, I did that too fast. As you can see, we're kind of going on lots of different topics. So, but before we even got the first one out there, posted the first one, we had been doing a lot of brainstorming of ideas and things that we wanted to take up. So, and we did. So this one was called "What's in a Name?" Episode 3. Came on the heels of the signing Southern, and we were looking into specifically local, what names were borrowed from Powhatan language, or also called Virginia Algonquin. Names, words, and immediately when you come down here, and probably lots of other areas on the East Coast, but you see road signs that reflect the scores of locations, that are like Rappahannock, Chesapeake. Piankatank is one of my favorites. Poquoson is a whole little town here. And so also our day-to-day language is peppered with words that come from, and we were looking specifically at the ones from Virginia Algonquin. But I'm going to play the clip, and this is Mike Lusby. He actually was a technician at the Sound Sliver, and Prue just mentioned him because his brother was deaf, but he also had an amazing radio voice. So we asked him if he could read some of the some quotes from The Map of Virginia by John Smith. Record some of the ethnography that John Smith had done. So this is the clip of Mike Lusby reading as if he's John Smith.
Plums there of 3 sorts, the red and the white like our hedge plums, but the other, which they call puchamins, grow as high as a palmetto. The fruit is like a medlar. It is first green, then yellow, and red when it is ripe. If it be not ripe, it will draw a man's mouth awry with much torment. But when it is ripe, it is delicious as an apricot.
And I like the one above that where it says, "An opossum hath a head like a swine, and a tail like a rat, and is the bigness of a cat. Under her belly she hath a bag, where she lodgeth, carrieth, and sucketh her young." So a clear description of opossum there, which is a word that came from Powhatan language. So to begin our etymological journey, we tapped into these works of John Smith, but also William Strachey, and even Roger Williams up in Rhode Island, who had written an extensive ethnography. And then also Thomas Harriot, who was actually came to the North Carolina coast. He was a very famous scientist later, but at the time he was young and had been hired by Sir Walter Raleigh to do navigation techniques as they were crossing the ocean. And he ended up writing an ethnography of the Croatoan people by working with Wanchese and Manteo. So we tapped into those things, and we learned from John Smith, we learned accounts of words like raccoon, possum, persimmon, as you can see. And we also got stuck on a word, which was the most revealing and most enlightening part of our journey in this one, was the word menhaden, which is that fish over there. And what we found from that is, the murkiness of word origins. And in this particular situation, it was the origin of this word was as slippery as the fish. So we ended up actually finding something in Roger Williams, a Narragansett word, which was munawatiag. And that was potentially close to the menhaden. So it might have been a portmanteau of two Native American words in New England. So it wasn't Virginia at all, we ended up finding out, even though the menhaden is a very important local fish. It is at the bottom of the food chain, and it is the food for predators such as bluefish, sharks, striped bass, eagles, osprey, all kinds of predators, because it's small. And so anyway, we looked into Roger Williams' work, but we also found the work of G. Brown Good, who, even though he died at 45, he was an amazing ichthyologist, scientist, who actually rose to become the head of the fisheries for the United States within that short time. Wrote a 7-volume book on the fisheries of the United States, and a 600-page book on the history of the menhaden, which is how we found it. So it was super interesting journey for us to try to find the origin of menhaden. We talked with, for this particular episode, we talked with Scott Dawson. He was the author of The Lost Colony in Hatteras Island, and he has an online vocabulary, a list of vocabulary of Croatoan, and we discussed that with him. And we also had an email correspondence with Ives Goddard. He's the Smithsonian Emeritus Linguist and expert on Algonquin linguistics. And he consoled us about the menhaden, because he said that tracking down the origins of fish names in particular, because of these fishing communities, how isolated, and anyway, he said it's notoriously difficult. And in this case, it was quite difficult. So, but we were resolved that we figured out something. We figured out it is hard.
Indeed. And the menhaden is still making headlines, every year here in the Chesapeake Bay, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very topical too. One day we'll discover the exact origin of it.
Yes, we believe that. Okay, we're going to move to episode 4.
Okay, before I talk about this, I see in the chat that Greg has said that they're familiar with Walt Wolfram, who I quoted in the deaf episode. And I just want to say he was so gracious in giving us a wonderful interview very early on, and we've used his wisdom on several occasions. I like to call him the Alfred Hitchcock of our podcast. He makes a sneak appearance every so often. But yeah.
Okay, and I'll play a clip from our next one. We traveled all the way into the medical field for this one. This was episode 4.
We are trained to listen really hard while we are portraying the patient. And because what we're trying to do is answer the question that they asked. And if they ask a little one, we're trained to say, well, if they say, so it says here you've got a sore throat, we'll say, yep. And we'll stop right there. If they say, so what brings you in today? Oh, Katie barred the door. Out comes the whole thing, and our toe hurts, and anything else. So that's kind of the way it is.
Okay, that was Alison Shea. She's a longtime standardized patient educator at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk. In the clip, she's explaining one way in which standardized patients role play to train medical students to improve their communication skills. So this was one of the episodes where we started with one idea, the idea of a single interview with ODU professor Dr. Stacy Defferbaugh, who Jill and I had both taken classes with her. Her research specialty is in patient-provider interactions, particularly those involving physician's assistants and nurse practitioners. And she uses the methods of discourse analysis. So that is how conversations unfold, the effects of different question styles, the role of small talk, and so forth. And I have to say that personally, I just get so nervous when I see a physician taking notes or a provider taking notes on my sort of idle chit chat when I go in the office. But what we learn is everything has a purpose, right? So in this instance, she's looking at conducting diagnostic interviews and how to do that in the 15 or 20 minutes that are typically allotted to medical visits. So her interview was intriguing for us, including all the difficulties of doing research in a medical setting with all the HIPAA rules on privacy and so forth. But we felt that it might be a little too technical for a general audience, and we also felt that the topic deserved a broader approach. And quite honestly, we just have a habit of complicating things. Like when things could be simple, it just seems too good to be true. So we expand. So we expanded. But we do feel that everybody has an experience in a medical setting, right? So everybody could relate to this topic. So the language basis was to demonstrate the importance of question styles and how open-ended questions lead to better information. And Defabau gave this example, and in fact, they're both sort of open-ended questions, but you can see that one is much more likely to elicit information than the other one. So she gave the example, do you have any questions? Or simply, any questions? And as she says, that suggests the answer should be negative, should be no, because of the any, right? And that compares to what questions do you have, which is, please tell me what questions you have, which would elicit a positive response. So something as tiny as that to tweak the language makes a big difference, or can make a big difference in getting information to make an accurate diagnosis. The standardized patient educators emphasize the importance of establishing trust and empathy. And empathy, of course, is hard to measure and determine, but Defabau pegged it by the patient's perception and response. So if the patient responded in a way that indicated they felt that the prior speech had been empathetic, you could tell that by the response. So that's how she would measure that. And another factor in this provider-patient relationship was provided by Dr. Latanya Russell. She's a pediatrician. She's there, I think, the bottom right there, second from the right on the bottom. A pediatrician and medical director for Centera's community-based clinics statewide. And she emphasized the importance of storytelling and finding clues in patients' stories. So she actually said she manipulates her schedule so that patients she feel that might take more time, need more time to tell her in a more roundabout way. She'll put them like the last appointment of the day so that she can get the full context. So the local context for this story was that Old Dominion University, where Defabau is a researcher, linguistics researcher, has merged. At this time, it was in the process of merging with the medical school, Eastern Virginia Medical School, where those two standardized patients we see, Temple West and Allison Shea, are pictured on the bottom left. And the whole merger is being largely financed by Centera Health System, which is where the two providers on the right, Bob Morrison and Latanya Russell, work for the Centera system. So essentially, we had all three, the trifecta, represented in speaking to these people. And the takeaway for me was patients aren't trained in conversation like this, so that the health provider really needs to be, and wow, they can really make a big difference in how they get good information from patients if they are well trained. And particularly, I think it was you, Jill, pointed out that each year in medical school with these standardized patients, they reduce the amount of time, right, to get to that 15 or 20 minutes where they nail the information.
Temple West said that by third year, they have to have it at 15 minutes. So.
Yeah. So that was very interesting. And just a surprise piece of information that came out of this, I mean, it's just random information, where there was the background of the physician's assistant profession, that it started, I think, with a physician at Duke University or Duke Medical School. It was started as a way to employ former medics from the Vietnam War. So they had military medics coming home who were, well, you know, had tremendous experience in the field, but didn't have the full medical training. And so this was a way to fast track them into civilian practice to use their skills. So I found that very interesting, that one.
Especially Powhatan Algonquin coming back. It means a lot because it's the sound that was in Virginia before any other language. You know, it what was spoken. So I'm very partial to Virginia history, being from Virginia all the way back, you know, on my dad's side.
Yeah.
So there's a place in my heart that's Virginia always, you know, and having the native language spoken in Virginia, it's almost it makes your heart swell.
That is just such a great clip. That was Ian Costello. I just love that, being from Virginia all the way back. I mean, he just says it all in that brief sentence, right? Anyway, Ian Costello, he's pictured there on the left. When we spoke to him, he was clean shaven, but he's a former Army language expert. He has a specialty in Asian languages. He has like a facility for Asian languages, and I think he was trained in Chinese by the Army. He's a member of the Mattapanai tribe, and he's a consultant on the PAIR Consortium's multi-year effort to awaken the Powhatan language, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And he is currently a resident of Hawaii, but obviously with very strong ties to his native Virginia. So again, like the previous episode on health talk, this episode took a very different form from what I had anticipated. I went to a seminar, an Indigenous language preservation seminar at ODU with a panel of 4 speakers. And I did learn from them that there's a little bit of a rift in the Indigenous language community between people who want to preserve what's evident and those who are committed, like this group I talked to reviving their speech and introducing written versions where one did not exist before. Anyway, I was simply planning to report on the conference and what the different speakers said, but through what sociolinguists call the snowball method, I serendipitously talked to someone and then someone else and someone else and someone else, and who mentioned PAIR, which is an acronym for the Powhatan Algonquian Intertribal Roundtable. It's a consortium of 8 local tribes here in Hampton Roads, in Sacomica, I think it's called, was the original region, led by the Chickahominy, and their names are on the slide. Jill, you wanted to read the name?
Sure. There's the Upper Mattapanai, there's the Mattapanai and Pamunkey and Chickahominy tribe, who I think are leading the pair. There's the Eastern Chickahominy tribe, Rappahannock, Nansemond, and the Potomac.
Right, so these 8 tribes have all got together and they received a 3-year federal grant to revive the Powhatan or Virginia Algonquin language. They're calling the project Omasan, which means to awaken or reawaken. The language has not been spoken probably for close to 300 years, but at least more than 250 years. And for the writing, they're using, and you can see this on the right hand of the screen, they're using the Canadian Aboriginal syllabics, which was actually developed for the Cree, who are related to the Algonquin, but it was developed by a missionary in the late 1800s. And Costello pointed out that it has 4 directions, which is very important for native culture, and that you change the directions and it changes the sounds of the vowels. And he actually uses it to text in English, like he adapts English to using this alphabet in order to make it more familiar for him. So that's wonderful. So the language basis was to look into what's involved in reconstituting a language, right? Revitalizing a language for which you have so little information. So because Virginia, this area of Virginia was colonized so early, the language disappeared more rapidly than for the Western tribes, which tended to maintain their language longer and not be as severely impacted. One of the differences, though, was that a couple of colonial leaders, Jill has already mentioned John Smith, he was a governor and a founder of Jamestown, and he was really a linguist. I guess he kept scrupulous records about the names of things and little translations and descriptions of everything, the people. And in addition to that, there are also, of course, Native American place names, names of trees and plants, as we'll hear about later, all of which have left their mark on our current contemporary culture. As Costello would say, the history and language is, quote, hiding in plain sight, like everywhere you go once you start looking at it. So in addition to Costello, we spoke to, he's worked on the language actually for 20 years by himself, just out of interest, personal interest. And he's now consulting with this pair group officially. But we spoke to a professional linguist, Stephanie Hasselbacher, who I think is a William and Mary graduate, and she's an expert in native language revival work, and also to the Chickahominy members who are leading the project, Lenora Adkins and Kayla Locklear. And we did also speak to ODU instructor Cole Matheson. He's a member of the Cherokee Western Band who's studying Cherokee, but he just underpinned, along with Adkins and Locklear, that language is identity. And so the importance of learning the language and having access to a language that your ancestors spoke is just so incredibly meaningful. So even if it's fragments, even if it's just greetings, that in itself just has a tremendous power for them of reclaiming their identity. So that was just very exciting to find.
Right. CEO Lenora Adkins expressed that a lot, and talking about teaching songs to the children and just using that language at home just really connected them with their identity. So very, very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So we'll keep going. This is a slide from episode 6, Creative Community Spoken Word in Hampton Roads. And the clip is from LaCroix Nixon. He's in the center there, him reading part of his one of his spoken word performances. So I'm going to play that first.
So me and my friend Dante were trying out for the high school football team. Now, before the tryout, I asked him what he was thinking about. I could tell he had a lot on his mind, and he looked at me with eyes heavier than a 4th and long, talking about some, "Hey, bro, I don't think I'm gonna make it." And I looked at him like, "What do you mean?" See, Dante was one of the greatest athletes I had ever seen, but unbeknownst to me, he was already playing a different game, running a different route, toting a different kind of rock, a star, running back behind a different kind of block. He already had bigger problems to tackle. Problems like, how was his sister gonna eat tonight? Or what was he gonna do to get off the sidelines to make sure his mama ain't gotta work no more? Hopefully putting a quarter back in her pocket for every time she had to stand up and be the franchise player for the family. Or what was he gonna do to not end up like his father?
So that was LaCroix Nixon. And interestingly about spoken word is it's all memorized. As you can see, they're standing up there with no paper. Well, Tanya has some paper, but so we wanted to explore the world of spoken word poetry in Hampton Roads. It's a vibrant scene, and it engages young people in words, poetry, language, communication, which is the lifelong dream of many language arts educators. So it is also,
it was inspirational to hear how they had been, really their teachers in middle and high school had inspired them. It was wonderful.
yes, yeah, and even the community college, because Tanya Cunningham's professor in community college inspired her as well. So, and we interviewed the 3 of them. On the left is George Mendez, the middle is LaCroix Nixon, and then Tanya Cunningham is on the right. And really, I mean, this is just a brief discussion of this, because really the word isn't, power is in the words that they share in their performances. But when it came down to it, one of the biggest takeaways for us from this, I actually knew the people before we started the process, and I had no idea how important community is and connection and is to this spoken word community. It's a very young community. George Mendez, for example, on the left, he met his wife at the venue that he goes to and performs in Norfolk, and they married in the venue. So, and just also people going through hard times. It's a very supportive community, a connection to language and expression. And we learned some things, some sort of linguistic-y things. We learned well, first of all, the difference between spoken word and slam. So you might have heard of slam poetry. Slam is the competition, and spoken word is the genre. So if you hear of slam, it means that they are being judged, and it's a competition. And some of the words that come out of that competition, motif, is a very literary word, but scheming is another one, and it's not, planning something illicit. Scheming is just like we would say that linguistic term of schema. So it comes, I think personally, it comes directly from that. It's foregrounding topic throughout the performance. So, and then the other one is really interesting because they're all memorized, right? So a poet with deep pockets is a poet that has at least 8, according to George Mendez, memorized poems ready to go at any moment. And then another interesting thing was the calibration poet, and that's more of the performance part, but that's the poet that comes first. And just like a starting act or something like that, kind of keeps that bar a little bit low because there's an inflation of scoring apparently in slam poetry. So it was just really interesting jargon and wonderful studying the rhythms of this poetry, and just the community was the main thing that came out of that for me. It's just so powerful.
I was thrilled by it because I had no familiarity with spoken word or what it was, or slam, and so it was incredible to find this community. And I mean, there are venues all over the region too. So, and competitions, people going all over the country to compete. So it was really exciting.
Yes.
And also Tanya's story, because she's from Williamsburg, and she talked about going back 5 generations, her family that now numbers, like extended family, 300 people or something, and they sort of have developed their own language, and she uses, their own dialect, and she uses some of that in her poetry and her spoken word. Yeah. So that was fascinating. Always.
Yeah. So this is episode 7, and Prue's going to tell you, it's just a brief thing.
Yeah, I'm just going to really zip through this because we named it the Doldrums, and it was our 7th episode. It was a super hot summer, and then we're like, oh my goodness, we never told people where or what Hampton Roads is or what our name is, Languaging in Hampton Roads. And in a little bit, Jill's going to talk about how names stick, but I think Hampton Roads is an example of a name that has not really stuck. So we're working with the unfortunate name, but you can see on the map that there it is in the water with the James, where the James and the Elizabeth rivers feed into the Chesapeake Bay. So it started as a name for this waterway, and I found a couple of other roads that are actually waterways. One is Castle Roads in Bermuda, and the other was Lahaina Roads in Hawaii, where the terrible fire was. But roads means a sort of a sheltered channel, a safe harbor. So I love the idea of a safe harbor because there's a bridge across here, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. And when you go across it, you see all these ships waiting to come into the port to unload, actually. And sometimes you see submarines and aircraft carriers leaving too. But it's also so the name given to the land mass that we are in, and it's a statistical area of 9 cities and 11 counties. And here on the left, you have Virginia Beach, which is part of it. And then below is Norfolk, and you see an aircraft carrier there. And the lighthouse, where was the lighthouse, Jill?
That's Cape Henry Lighthouse.
Cape Henry, which is Virginia Beach.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hampton, which is the oldest continuous English-speaking community in the US, I think is also part of our region there. So we do use the term Hampton Roads interchangeably with Tidewater. Tidewater is more of a geographical area, and Hampton Roads is a politically, economically designated area. And then the name Languaging, we wrestled with different names, most of which we found had been sort of taken. And you can see the description of what it is here, a way to describe the ongoing process of becoming oneself. and one's language practices as people interact and make meaning in the world. And another definition of that of languaging is also to solve complex problems through the use of language. So just like the active idea, and as you have gathered from our presentation, we are incorporating all types of language and interpreting everything broadly. So I think it fits us, though the HR is maybe a little
It gets confused with you know, human resources. Sometimes people, oh,
Right.
will you do human resources? Or like, not really, no.
or LHR, which looks like an hour, and people say, well, I don't have an hour. But anyway,
Yes.
it's all good. And that's our name, Languaging in Hampton Roads. And we hope that along the way with this, that people are learning more about our region. Yeah. Okay. And now on to my favorite episode.
Oh, I didn't know that. So, this was episode 8, and we just thought well, you know, it started just from being curious about road names, which everybody is. So we went into toponymy, and we had a list of all these different places that we were curious about, and we decided on 3 because they were on the outer edges of Hampton Roads. So we picked 3. Well, there's a 4th one that we haven't done yet. But yeah, so we picked 3, and Elephant Fork. Oh wait, I need to play the clip first. So this is another clip. It's a pretty low volume, and in our doing this episode, we decided to go on a road trip to all these places, and we were kind of person on the street, and we, you know, talked to people, and we collected some really interesting things, and this is one of those. It is a little low volume. It is at a car dealership, so you'll hear in the background, you hear some kind of noise. So just wanted to warn you about that. So here it is. Let me, this little mouse is working funny to me, but here we go.
One morning we got to school and we sitting in the classroom. And they came in our classrooms and took 7 kids out of, this was before school was integrated.
Okay.
Whoa.
What year was that?
I don't know, but I'm gonna tell you what happened. And don't get offensive when I tell you.
No, we're ready.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Mount Zion was the black people's school. Kings Fork was the white people's school, right? This was for integration. Well, what happened was they came in our classroom and took 8 of us out of the classroom, put us on a bus, hadn't told our parents, and took us to King Fork and told us this is where we were going to school at from now on.
So you went to Kings Fork from then on?
That's how they integrated school.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was Angelo Scott. So we met in a car dealership, and he recalled off the cuff his experience of school integration in elementary school. And the year was 1971, when a court order required Suffolk schools to integrate, more than a decade after it was federally mandated. So that just came, we were just asking about if they knew what Elephant Fork came from. And so we started collecting stories, but curiosity about road names inspired this podcast. And so Elephant Fork was the first stop in our road trip. And then we went to Cuffy Town, and then we went to Chicks Beach. So Elephant Fork ended up being really fascinating. We talked to a lot of people there, and finding out that most people thought the name Elephant Fork, which there's no sign around anywhere, it's just the name of the area. And it is on Google Maps, but there's actually no sign that says it's there. And we found out most people thought it came from the elementary school, which is called Elephants Fork with an apostrophe. And so learning that they use the name every day, they know the area, but not, first of all, except for one historian and Mary Chapman, who you heard earlier, they had an inkling that it had come from a billboard. But other than that, people didn't know where it came from. And actually, we learned by using the archives in Virginia Chronicle, which is Library of Virginia's archive of Virginia newspapers. We delved into that, and we found that it actually H.J. Bowen was owned an emporium, was a buyer and owned an emporium, and he had a huge tin elephant sign on that fork in 1903. And so in 1928, a reporter wanted to answer the question, why do we call this Elephant Fork? And he wrote the story that was in that newspaper about that gigantic tin elephant that was advertising an emporium. And apparently it also was well known that it scared the horses as they, it was so big, it scared the horses.
Right, right. And I love that the theory was, I mean, some people's theory was about the circus, right? Because Barnum and Bailey, Ringling Barnum and Bailey used to make annual visits to the area, right, and have the elephant walk from the train station to the big top. And
yes, yeah, that was, yeah, other people had said that.
one of the theories. Yeah.
So, and then we went out to Coffeetown, which is on the outer edge of Chesapeake, close to the North Carolina border. And we went there because of the name Cuffy is a family name. And we found out before we went that it was a family of free black slaves. Oh, sorry, free blacks from, sorry about that, from 1700s had actually established the community. So it was a very old community. And then during the Civil War, there were famously 13 went and fought for the Union. And so they're buried there in a cemetery, which we didn't actually reach because we learned from road trips that sometimes you don't get to your destination. It was in the middle of planting season and it was not reachable. So we trod through a muddy path and all this, and we never actually made it to the cemetery. But we saw their famous church and all the road signs that were named after the Cuffy family. So was fascinating. And then we moved on to Chicks Beach. So learning just where the names came from were just kind of fascinating, but we also found, dug down into history as well to figure out. And in Chicks Beach, that one has apostrophe, by the way. It's the name of an area that is called actually officially Chesapeake Beach. But in 1950s and 60s, there was a well-known favorite person who sold hot dogs and had a special sauce. And his name was Chick Leddington. And since then, all the locals in Virginia Beach know this as Chicks Beach. And this is probably the only sign that you see right there that has actually chicks on it. That land, we started digging in, and that land had been farmed by Anne Bradford, who was the daughter of Littleton Tazewell in the colonial times, and then all the way through to a heyday of real estate development and that kind of thing, and then finally to this where it's now Chicks Beach on the Chesapeake Bay. So there's lots of good history.
You should tell about Beetle Bailey too.
Oh yes, Beetle Bailey is who was babysat by Chick. Still lives there, and he drives around on his little golf cart, and he's just he's kind of the unofficial mayor, they call of him. So it's a lot of character.
And he has a little sign, right? Because there's a restaurant on the site of the old hot dog stand.
Yes.
And Beetle Bailey has a little plaque in there, like this is where he props up the bar.
Yeah. I mean, it was really good to go out there. We started, we stumbled upon something called the commemorative landscape because we were just looking at road names. And when we learned, there are roads like we also like to delve into like 1, 2, 3, First Street, Second Street, Third Street, and name roads after trees and those kind of things. But when it's named after something, it's part of what, some linguists might call the commemorative landscape, or even sociologists. So, and that is kind of a hot topic right now because it's changing, right? And it always is changing, that commemorative landscape. And we kind of happened on urban semiotics, another sort of subdiscipline of semiotics and linguistics, kind of interdisciplinary, about the study of billboards and signs and even the numbers on buildings is part of that study. And our biggest takeaway was names stick. 1903, there was a tin elephant, and they're still calling it Elephant Fork. And maybe because the uniqueness of elephant, maybe the sign on the elementary school just kept it going. But it did have a name change. There was a road that called Elephant Fork, and we saw from those newspapers there was public discussion of renaming it, and it became Godwin Boulevard after Mills Godwin, the governor.
Right.
Yeah, they still call it Elephant Fork. There's no road named after it. So that's names stick and names commemorate.
Right, Jill, there's a question about what the document is in the middle of the slide.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that's a good question. That is actually, I believe it is the affidavit.
One morning we
Sorry,
got to school.
sorry. Of one of the it's a registry of one of the Cuffies, and I believe it was sorry, certified. Good question. I think it was register. Let me see if I can move this so I can see that a little bit better. It's a very good question. Court register.
Oh, look, something about something mulatto, something.
Yeah.
50 years of age.
It's a very good question. I forgot what this was.
Oh, okay.
It is something official. It had their names on it.
Yeah.
And spelling is why I actually looked at that document, because it's Cuffee. And there's a lot of different spellings of the name, even in just like a very small area. There's a road called Coffey. There was the name Cuffee, and there was also Cuffey town, Cuffee Town Road. So a lot of different spellings, and that was very typical, not just of African American communities at that time, but in general, the spelling of names then. So, and I'm sorry, I'll find out for you what that is.
One of the things that came out of this episode, one of the things we'd learned that I just hadn't, it's again, something you just I hadn't thought about before, was how places get their names and who determines what the official names are. So I was very excited to come across the US Board of Geographic Names that has all sorts of weird rules. And it started in the 1890s and I think was sort of regularized in the 1950s. But you realize that for maps and everything, you have to have standardized names, right, that everybody agrees on. And this is the agency that takes care of it. But among its quirks are that it only allows 5 places in the entire United States of geographic features. So we're talking about sea, beach, river, hill, those sort of geographic features, to have an apostrophe in them. So if you're ever worried about whether to spell something with an apostrophe or not, that's a geographic feature, most likely it's not going to have an apostrophe. So the one well-known exception is Martha's Vineyard. And then there are 4 other like very lesser known places that are allowed this apostrophe according to the US Board on Geographic Names. And it also has 3 slurs that it outright bans. And again, that tells us, about prejudices and that people will be actually using these names, that they had to ban it in the 50s. Yeah, one of which is the name for a Native American woman. So sort of surprising things too, like that. But that was so interesting to me about how you go about naming. And Jill did a lot of research into local naming and how that works with different government entities, right?
Yes, yeah, it's very localized, and also real estate developers get involved because they want certain things. So
right, and you had a big thing about the interstate system, like how you get signs on the interstate, and now I know you're an expert on fonts, so I know you were particularly interested. Right.
Yes. So, and we're going to actually move on to our episode 9, which is the ebb and flow of coastal Carolina. Oh, sorry, I have that wrong. Episode 9 is what it takes to raise bilingual children. I apologize.
Okay. Yeah. So this was one of my favorites to do. Are you going to run the clip?
Yeah, let's do the clip first. So
I can say about myself, because I would like to talk in Russian to my kids. They have to know how to read and write because they have their origin. Also, Russian language is part of their culture, and actually they feel themselves not really 100% American. So they have also culturally kind of American, Italian, Russian. So we have this kind of mixed culture. But Russian language is a part of the culture. It's part of their life.
So that was Natalia Perichatko of Kazakhstan. She's the co-founder and director. This is a picture of her on the right here, bottom right, with the children at the Russian school that she founded and directs with Elena Chambers of Belarus. So Natalia is married to an Italian, and her 2 children are actually trilingual in English, Russian, and Italian. So the basis for this one was just my interest in language acquisition. both the theory and the practice, because obviously it was a big part of my studies for teaching English as a second language. And bilingualism has just always interested me because I've certainly never achieved any level of fluency in another language, though I've studied a few. So we started out by sharing the changes in research that now show the benefits of bilingualism, both in the structure of the brain and in cognition and cognitive achievements. And we also touched on the changes in attitude toward English variations and how the former suppression of heritage languages has given way to their being valued and even rewarded economically, right? So at one time, people just wanted to be American, speak English, and put their heritage country behind them. And now that's really changed with a more global economy and people going back and forth. So I interviewed several women from an immigrant group that was formed by a friend in 2016. And that's when immigration issues were, at the political forefront. And so most of these women came to the US in the 1980s and 1990s, all highly educated. They had all studied English before arrival in the US and all have maintained not only maintain their native language, but also passed it along to their children, and in one instance also to their grandchildren. So I had a double interest in this episode. First of all, in how the immigrants retained their own language and how they acquired English, and also in how and why they felt it important for their children to learn their heritage language. And I was also curious about just how difficult it is, because more often than not, when I've asked people, foreign-born people, about raising their children bilingual, the response I've had is, well, we tried it for a couple of years, but it was just too difficult. So the context is that here in Hampton Roads, we have a lot of medical, military, and high-tech facilities. So we have NASA and NATO headquarters and the Jefferson Lab and Eastern Virginia Medical School. And this is Sylvina Boca on the bottom row here, who came over just as the Jones Institute, the first in vitro clinic in the US, was opening here in Norfolk. And she came over from Argentina to work in that clinic. So we have a large proportion of highly educated immigrant employees. And interestingly, only 7% of our region in Hampton Roads are foreign born, and that compares with 13 or 14% in the state overall. So we actually have a low proportion of foreign born people. And so the ones I spoke to up top left here is Brenda Musto and her daughter Bernie. And I don't know if Brenda's still on the call, but she was earlier. And she is from Argentina. And but interesting, her family background was Italian. So her parents were Italian immigrants in Argentina. And then she came here with her family. And they have an entirely Spanish-speaking household. They speak English to Bernie outside the home, but inside the home is exclusively Spanish-speaking. So the takeaways from this episode was that it takes absolute commitment to be successful in raising a bilingual child. And anecdotally, you need total immersion to become fluent. All of the parents had had significant English education before they came, and all of them said they didn't gain any degree of fluency until they were here and they were immersed in it on a daily basis. The other thing that emerged from these half dozen interviews was that children pick up speech so readily when they're playing with their peers. So perhaps the most successful at raising, or the most easy path to bilingualism, was visits to families back home where the children got to play with their peers in their heritage language, because they picked it up without even thinking about it. Excuse me. A point that the Russian school teachers made was that you absolutely have to have also a formal education in a language. Just speaking at home isn't sufficient. And that's not just for the writing and the grammar, but actually to adopt more complex language. Like, home language is typically limited. So unless you're exposed in an academic environment, you don't develop the greater complexities of the language. And they also recommended what they call the OPOL method, one parent, one language. So whoever's, if you're a Spanish speaker, you speak Spanish to your children. If your spouse is an English speaker, they speak English. So that I had not heard about before, and it seemed to make a lot of sense. And the other thing I learned that there's been an explosion of resources in our area in the past decade. Like a lot of times people said it was super difficult initially at schools. Schools were not sympathetic. They, didn't help them, didn't support them. But now throughout the region, there are Spanish and Russian daycares and preschools. There are weekend Ukrainian schools. And the public schools in Newport News and Virginia Beach, which I think are probably the two largest public school systems in our region, both offer dual immersion Spanish and English programs from first grade through 12th that are fully subscribed and have waiting lists. So it's really become very popular. The big surprise that I took from this episode was that children rebel so early against learning a second language. And for a lot of the parents, they said, well, it was when they started American school that they stopped it. But the Russian school operators said it's just standard at age 7 or 8 that children sort of push back against a second language, and that then they pick it up again as teenagers, which is also, I would have thought, you'd expect teenagers to be more self-conscious or something. So that was a surprising learn that they had absolute statistics on that happens. I also learned that Virginia and now many other states have what's called a seal of biliteracy on their high school graduation diplomas or high school diplomas, so that even if the language isn't taught in the local schools, if you can take an equivalency exam. So that was the case for these the members of the Russians, most of the members of the Russian school, where Russian is not taught in the public schools, but they can take an exam, and they actually had 4 teenage boys who achieved that seal of biliteracy this year, right around Thanksgiving. And the debunking was in the old theory that children might become delayed or confused in English if they were also using a second language. It has been shown, I think, that sometimes children are a little bit delayed in writing English when they've started with a different language, but the idea that it's something to be avoided has been completely debunked by the research, which shows all the benefits of bilingualism and even of just studying another language at any age. So that's been a big change. So that's what I found.
Yeah, and I love the way
I'm never going to be bilingual.
Prue really reached into her networks of international families, and it was just amazing to watch the breadth of, and also a lot of people don't know how international our area is. In fact, I didn't know how, even though I taught ESL at Thomas Nelson, or now it's now called something else, but and I had very diverse classes. We have lots of international organizations in the area, NATO's here, and then we have also Jefferson Labs that attracts a lot of international scientists. So we have a big international group.
Yeah.
All right, and this was episode 10, the ebb and flow of coastal Carolina languages. And I'll play the clip. This is Scott Dawson in the clip. Oops, sorry. Oh my goodness.
There's artifacts that you find that, like, I'll just give you a real life example is the easiest way. Like a Rashaquan. A Rashaquan is a hoe that's made out of a whelk shell. But we don't have a word for that, so we just use the native one. And it's just easier, and it makes it easier to record and everything. So you look for certain modifications where there's been a hole drilled at the 2 o'clock position on the spiral, and it's shaped like kind of like a mask that you'd wear underwater with a little notch in the middle. That's where the wooden handle went in. And then the spike on the other side is going to be smooth and probably about a 45-degree angle from where they're hitting it and dragging it back toward them. And you get that, that's a Rashaquan. But so we use some of the native words, especially for the native artifacts. And I think we should keep calling them that instead of renaming it a Jack's Reef arrowhead, or whatever, call it what they called it.
I love that. That was Scott Dawson. pictured on the left. And Jill, I'm looking at this word list underneath them and all the names for fish, and I'm thinking about
Yeah,
you.
I know.
Anyway, Scott Dawson, and I'm going to be very quick on this slide because we have one more that deserves a little time. He's a lifelong resident of the island of Hatteras with deep family roots on the island. He's an amateur archaeologist and historian, but he has devoted his life to preserving artifacts, pre-colonial artifacts, Native American artifacts, and also fragments of the language of the Carolina Algonquian language. And you see some of that below there. And he's also committed to debunking the myth of the lost colony on Roanoke Island. But we featured this episode because we had full interviews both with Scott Dawson on the left and Professor Walt Wolfram on the right. And they both had so much to say about different things, and we'd only been able to use a little bit. So they somehow tied together because Scott was talking about the pre-colonial era, and Dr. Wolfram was talking about the current dialect in Ocracoke and in Robeson County inland. And the point he made, and of course he's a professional linguist, an academic linguist, was that there's more in common between the water communities of Virginia and North Carolina than there is between those water communities and their inland, I can't think what the word would be, of the closer inland communities. Like the land-based communities develop language differently, and the water-based communities traded up and down the coast together, and so they share many elements of language. So he's saying that the language on Ocracoke is closer to the language on Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay than it is to inland Robeson County. And he also mentioned that the specific dialect on Ocracoke Island, where you see some of the vocabulary here on the right, bottom right, is the dialect is disappearing because there's no longer sufficient native-born population there, and every summer sees a huge influx of Hispanic workers in the tourist trade. And so the dialect of Ocracoke, he basically said, will be extinct soon, in contrast to the dialect of the Lumbee, who are Native Americans who live in Robeson County and have high concentration of numbers and have maintained a distinctive dialect of English and continue to do so. They have majority Lumbee schools and all the things that go into maintaining a dialect. So together, we felt that this episode just illustrated that language is in constant flux because we have the change from the English colonists, destroying the native language and then its evolution. And it depends, language change depends on demographic changes over time, and it shows how geography also intersects with language and with identity. So this was a good pairing in the same way I think that our first episode was a good pairing and showing change and flux over time in a small area.
And this was our last episode, or no, our second to last episode. We also have episode 12, which I'll talk about briefly right at the end, but this was a super fun episode, as all of them were. All of them have been super fun. This was focused on plant names, and I'm going to play a clip from Vicki Schufer. She's one of our experts that we consulted.
Poke salad. Right. That's one that needs to really be clarified. Poke salad, they hear it. They hear S-A-L-A-D. They go out, they identify poke, they get these big, beautiful leaves, they come in and make a salad. They spend the afternoon throwing up. If you eat it raw, it will make you throw up. Salad is not spelled S-A-L-A-D, it's spelled S-A-L-E-T. You'll see different spellings, S-A-L-L-E-T, different ways. But basically, it's a word that means cooked herb. You never eat it raw. And so that's a misunderstanding in the plant world. People, poke salad. Oh, I ate that once. Oh, I threw up all afternoon.
We thought that was a really important one to include. in case you ever go look for poke salad. That was Vicki Schufer. She is of Wild Woods Farm in Virginia Beach, a naturalist and a herbalist. And we also, she's on the bottom right there. We also consulted Nicole Knudsen. She's in the upper left corner. She owns Lady Fern Native Plants. And then on the upper right corner is a mycologist, Sarah Winkowski, who happens to be related to me. So we consulted all of those experts, local experts. Sarah grew up here as well. So, and just kind of delved into common plant names. And we also learned a lot about scientific names. And learning that, you know, kind of thinking about that common plant names are actually vessels of the cultural history of a region. And scientific names also carry history. And occasionally, as we learned from one of our examples, there's some corporate intrigue as well. So delving into taxonomy, naming, and growing up in this area, I remember ecology camp and all those cool names that I learned, Indian pike, which now is called something else, I believe, and then wintergreen, and all these names kind of like bubbled up. And I was like, I really want to know the origins of some of these names. And we interviewed the experts, and to organize it, we kind of said, okay, let's organize it by starting up at the trees and then going down to the plants that grow on the ground and the soil, and then looking under the leaves and you know, under the logs for fungi. So that's how we organized the story development of this podcast. And the words themselves, they delighted us. It was from birthwort to snake root to Cornus Florida, which is actually the scientific name for dogwood, which is this state flower of Virginia. And also learning things that weren't name oriented, but that dogwood flower that we think of is not actually the flower. So those are called bracts, those white flowers. That's a picture of it right there in the center. That's not the flower part. The white part is an ornamental bract, which is like a leaf-like thing. So we learned a lot of stuff. And we kind of focused on local common names, and the term persimmon came up again because it was from that Virginia Algonquin Patchamin. Another one that came up was fascinating was Yaupon holly, which actually didn't come from a Native American word around here. It came from a Catawban word. But so yaw meaning tree and paw meaning leaf. So Yaupon holly is the only caffeinated tea in Northern America. So so there was interesting story that Vicki Schufer knew really well about the naming of Yaupon holly and the scientific name, because when it was named, which actually was in early Virginia time, the scientific name was duplicated. They had to change it. And so some corporate intrigue got involved in that because it was caffeinated. The East India Tea Company was concerned about the competition. So they engaged a botanist from Kew Gardens and said, we're going to influence the name of it. And because it has been used in a ritual, a Native American ritual of purging, they named it Ilex vomitoria, thinking that that would dissuade people from drinking it. So that actually has been well documented, and Vicki has written on that before. It was just really interesting story about naming.
Yeah.
So we learned about our takeaway really from this was learning about the complexity of plant naming, and that the scientific name is relied on by scientists in order to ensure that they're always talking about the same thing. But ironically, sometimes that scientific name has to change for various reasons. Like here's an example that Vicki came up with. The Virginia snakeroot scientific name changed from the genus Aristolochia to Indodica. So for some, referring to the common name of Virginia snakeroot actually was more expedient, even for looking at it scientifically, because the name change caused some confusion. So they relied on the common name for that. And I guess our biggest surprise coming out of this was that the influence of botanists in early Virginia, Nicole really talked about this quite a bit, that the early Virginia was a hotbed, literally, of botany. And Linnaeus even got involved. There was a duo, a father-son, Tradescant the elder, and John Tradescant the elder, and John Tradescant the younger. And the younger was in Virginia, and he was getting these samples over to his father in England. And so Linnaeus named an entire genus of birthwort or spiderwort after them, the Tradescantia genus. So super interesting, great learning about the names of things that I always wondered about. So, and also, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, just as you say, that whole thing of how Virginia was such a hub of learning in the colonial period with
oh, absolutely.
about Thomas Hariot, and then with these botanists. I mean, they were really connected to the greatest scholars and scientists in the world at the time. It's just must have been a very exciting time.
Yes. And that lovely looking fungus on that picture is called chicken of the woods for some reason, I guess, because it looks like feathers.
Right.
Yeah. And then one more thing, that the Spanish moss there, which actually is becoming highly endangered in this area. Nicole told us about that, but it's actually not Spanish and it's not moss. So just if you ever wondered. One more thing we wanted to share with you is that episode 12 is about endangered alphabets, and we talked with Tim Brooks, and Prue can tell you a little bit about the upcoming day that will be celebrated.
Yes, okay, well, so we just posted episode 12. It was an interview with Tim Brooks, who I believe has been a speaker here at the museum, and we learned about him from Greg, and he was really interesting, and I just wanted to give him a little plug because he has, on January the 23rd, his second annual Endangered Writing Day. So if you go to endangeredalphabets.com, his website, or I think if you just Google Endangered Writing Day, it will take you to where you can register for the event. And it, I mean, his website just by itself is really fascinating. He has so much going on, investigating all the different alphabets in the world, many of them endangered. So that's on January the 23rd. Maybe I'll put something in the chat.
Poke salad.
All right. And that's it.
Yes, that's it. We do hope this inspires you to go out and not necessarily create a podcast, but the things that you can do, you can find out and share with locally with your community. So.
Do you want to play the fading music or not?
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry.
Thanks for listening. Tune in next month. Send your comments, questions, and any feedback you have to languaginghr@gmail.com. That's languaginghr@gmail.com.
And for full interviews and bonus resources, go to our website, languaginghr.wordpress.com.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And especially thank you, Jill and Prue, for your really excellent presentation. We do have a little bit of time left if anybody has any additional questions. Please go ahead and drop them in the chat, or you could just raise your hand since we're done with the formal presentation. I'd actually love to ask a question about just your process for developing the podcast. You have such a fascinating array of topics. How do you go about deciding what topics to feature and in what sequence? And also, how do you go about securing any guest speakers that you have?
Okay, Jill, you want to start?
Well, I guess so. So we did a lot of brainstorming ahead of, and we also had, pet projects that we had done during when we were getting our degrees. So that fed into a lot of that, but also just things that come up. So for example, Prue went to that conference and then learned about these other things. So kind of networking helps us come up with ideas, and also just kind of things that we're curious about. I know the sequence looks kind of all of it, but it's sort of like looking at a magazine in a way. So looking at, so we're not always doing the same topic. We kind of vary it up and yeah.
Right, because we could, I think if we, if we have a history heavy topic, then the next time we try to do something that's more contemporary or, that's to my mind is part of it. We don't want to be sort of stuck in one groove. So hence the great variety of things. But it really is sort of things just that we've been interested in. We keep a running list of it. And then it's a matter of finding people, who'll talk to you on a timely basis. And that can be a problem. We do nearly all our interviews on Zoom. Well, we do all our interviews on Zoom. We don't require people to come to the studio because the timing of that would just be impossible. But that can be, it can be a little nail biting getting people to commit to a certain time and all of that. And I should just say that it's very, very time consuming. I estimate that for every minute of a podcast, it takes about 2 hours.
Yes.
2 hours work.
Wow. Well, we can
That
certainly
was-
see the effort. So.
Yeah, that was something that we did not know before we started, but we learned.
Great, thank you so much.
If I can just chime in for a second, I want to applaud you both because one thing that really came out from this, at least to me, is you really look like you're having fun. I mean, your humor just shows through. I mean, like you're having fun. And that's hard to do with the podcast. I mean, I've listened to a bunch of them, and even the professional ones, they almost seem in some case like they're, going through the motions. But here it looks like you're actually having a good time. There's a lot of enthusiasm. So that's what struck me, at least.
Oh,
It's
well,
not a
good.
question, it's just an observation.
Right, because I'm sort of with you that typically, as you say, professionals, they will do like an interview with somebody. And basically, if you really like that person or you're really interested in their work or what they have to say, that's great. But mostly I find them a little bit boring, like they're too, so we try to make it more like a feature story, I think is sort of the attitude, but it involves a lot of editing, sound clips and script writing, and then how much humor to allow, because sometimes I'll be listening and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is, you're just laughing too much, right? And I mean, it's very interesting. You realize how manipulated all the sound you hear is because of the ums, the ers. I mean, all of that. You can spend hours just tweaking that.
Yeah. And we both are really curious, and this is our passion. So I think that kind of feeds into that, enjoying it. We don't do it every day. We don't do it every week. We have monthly and we switch off. So we're not, I mean, it's a lot, but it's not killing us. So
yeah. And we're always learning. I mean, to me, the excitement is that every episode we learn something unexpected, something we weren't looking for. And it's like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just say one other thing too. Again, this isn't really a question, it's an observation. This presentation, I think, has really demonstrated, at least in a way, what the National Museum of Language is all about, because our focus is on languages in general, all aspects of it. And you two have demonstrated that there's a lot of things you can do with language that's not that obvious. So I really think, and we owe you a debt of gratitude for that, because you're the epitome of what our museum is.
Well, thank you for that. And we really learned that in our work in sociolinguistics, because the kind of courses that you take cover so many different disciplines. And that was something we were also trying to reflect, because people, you say, oh, linguistics, and they think one thing, another person thinks another thing. So not knowing about this kind of umbrella term of what's involved.
But I'd like to say something, if I may. So first of all, I want to say that your presentation was very inspiring to me. That you took all these things which were sort of commonplace in a certain community, and you told a story about it and, wove in the linguistic aspects of it. And I think that it's the kind of thing, I hope that we can do things that are somewhat similar in our area in Maryland. Where most of us, well, our museum is based in Maryland, and some, but not all of the museum officers are living in the Maryland, DC, Northern Virginia area. So we're kind of local, but I've been thinking about it for a long time of trying to do more things that are sort of a local focus with language. And I just feel really inspired now to try to pursue that after hearing about all of your episodes. So I really want to thank you for sharing with us what you've been doing and how you did it. And I really want to take my hat off to you and what you've accomplished in a year with your project. So thank you.